In 1898, a lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was allowed to do something no one had ever done before. He was going to take the first photograph of a strange old cloth kept in a cathedral in Turin, Italy. He set up his heavy camera. He made the exposure. And late that night, in his dark room, he lowered the glass plate into the developing bath and waited for the image to appear. What rose out of the chemicals nearly made him drop it. On the cloth itself, the marks are faint and ghostly, like a shadow you can barely make out. But on his photographic negative, the shadows reversed. And staring back at him, in sharp detail, was the face of a man. A bearded man, eyes closed, marked with wounds. It was as if the cloth had been hiding a photograph for centuries, waiting for a camera to reveal it. That cloth is the Shroud of Turin. For millions of people, it is the burial shroud of Jesus, the linen he was wrapped in after the crucifixion. It is often described as one of the most studied artifacts in history. And after more than 100 years of science, here is the strange part. No one can agree on what it actually is. In 1988, 3 separate laboratories gave what sounded like the final word. They said the cloth was medieval. A fake. The argument should have ended right there. But it didn't. Because in the last 2 years, brand new tests, one using X-rays and one reading genetic traces in the fibers, have started pulling the date back toward the 1st century. And the fight that has broken out is not the fight you would expect. It is not simply science against faith. It is science against science. Stay with me, and I will show you why this mystery is still wide open. Let's start with the cloth itself. The shroud is a strip of linen a little over 4 meters long. On it lies the faint, full-length imprint of a man, front and back, as if a body had been laid on one half and the cloth folded over the top. The figure shows what look like wounds from a scourging, marks on the wrists and feet, and a wound in the side. And that image has a property that no one has fully explained. It behaves like a photographic negative, centuries before photography existed. There are no brushstrokes, no dyes pooling in the weave. The picture sits only on the very topmost fibers of the thread and does not soak through the cloth the way paint would. However it got there, it does not look like it was painted on. So how old is it? That is where the war begins. Go back to 1988. Small samples were cut from the shroud and sent to 3 respected laboratories in Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich. Each one used radiocarbon dating, the standard method for aging old organic material, and they agreed with remarkable confidence. With 95% certainty, the cloth dated to somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390. The Middle Ages. Right around the time the shroud first appears in the historical record. For most of the world, that closed the case. A medieval cloth, a beautiful, haunting forgery. But almost immediately, other researchers pointed at one detail. Look at where the sample came from. The piece they tested was cut from a single corner of the shroud, and critics argue that this exact corner is one of the areas that was repaired and rewoven over the centuries, after fires and handling damaged the edges. If newer threads had been woven into that corner, then the test may not have dated the shroud at all. It may have dated the patch. That objection has been argued back and forth for decades. And in 2026, a new textile study looked again at the leftover fibers from those 1988 samples. Its finding cut both ways. On one hand, the fibers looked consistent with the main cloth, with no obvious sign of a hidden repair. On the other, the same analysis found an odd statistical pattern across the samples, a drift in the apparent age from one spot to another, which hints that contamination was never fully cleaned off. So even the attempt to settle the argument left the door open. Now here is the twist that makes this story different from almost any other relic. The strongest new challenge to the medieval date does not come from a church. It comes from a physics lab. A researcher in Italy named Liberato De Caro used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering. Instead of measuring carbon, it measures how much the linen itself has broken down at the molecular level over time. He compared the shroud to other ancient fabrics of known age. And he reported that the closest match was not the Middle Ages at all, It was a piece of linen from around the 1st century from the fortress of Masada in Israel. If his method proves reliable, it would place the shroud at roughly 2,000 years old. But this is where our brand demands honesty. So let's be honest. That X-ray method has real weaknesses. Its results depend heavily on how the cloth was stored, on centuries of heat and humidity that are impossible to know precisely. It has not been widely repeated by independent teams. And the same group of researchers has proposed several different dating methods over the years, each one landing on the answer that the shroud is ancient. Even some experts sympathetic to the shroud have urged caution. One test pointing one way is not a verdict. It is a challenge to the old verdict. Which brings us to the freshest chapter, and the reason the shroud is back in the headlines right now. In 2026, scientists ran a deep genetic analysis of the dust and fibers of the cloth. They were not trying to date it. They were reading the biological history soaked into it over the centuries. And what they found was a crowd, multiple lines of human genetic material, traces of plants, of animals, even of Mediterranean coral, and microbes of the kind that thrive in extremely salty environments, like the region around the Dead Sea. To supporters, that sounded like confirmation, a cloth carrying a genetic signature leaning toward the Middle East. But listen carefully to what the researchers themselves said. Their results do not prove where the cloth came from, and they do not prove who it once covered. A relic touched by countless hands, repaired, carried across countries and centuries, will collect a little of everything. The genetic testing told us less about who was wrapped in the shroud than about everyone who touched it afterward. And that idea, everyone who came after, exposes the biggest hole of all, not in the science, in the history. Because the confident story of this cloth only begins in the year 1354 in a small village in France called Lirey. Its first certain owner was a French knight, Geoffrey de Charny, who died soon after, leaving no record of where he had gotten it, and almost at once, it caused a scandal. Within a few decades, a local bishop named Pierre d'Arcis wrote to the Pope, insisting the cloth was a cunning work of art, and claiming the artist who made it had even confessed. No confession survives today, and historians still debate how reliable the bishop's claim really was. But think about that. The earliest clear document we have about the Shroud of Turin is a letter calling it a fake. Everything before that village in France, the roughly 1,300 years between the 1st century and the year 1354, is a blank. Supporters fill that gap with theories of secret journeys and lost names. But theories are not records. And that silence is the single hardest problem for anyone who wants to call this the burial cloth of Jesus. So where does that leave us? Come back to that image, the one that stunned Secondo Pia in his darkroom. To this day, no one has been able to reproduce it using tools a medieval forger would have had and match every one of its strange properties at once. The negative effect, the shallow, surface-only staining, the lifelike detail. That is a real, unsolved puzzle. But an unsolved puzzle is not the same as a miracle. It is a question we cannot yet answer. And maybe that is the honest heart of the Shroud of Turin. The believers point to the image no one can explain. The skeptics point to the carbon date and the missing centuries. And every new test, the X-rays, the genetics, seems to hand each side just enough to keep the fight alive, and never quite enough to end it. The most studied cloth in the world. And still, after everything, it refuses to give up its answer. So after everything you've heard, where do you land? Is the shroud a 2,000-year-old mystery that science can't explain? Or a medieval masterpiece that has fooled the world for centuries? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. Thanks for watching. If you love a real mystery told straight, without the hype, subscribe for more mysteries of the past, and I will see you in the next one.